All right, let's say hello to the people. How we doing, Nova?
Absolutely. Let me give them a warm hello. Hey everyone, Nova here. Hope you're all doing great. We're about to dive into a really interesting chat, so thanks for joining us. Let's get started.
I really hope we got our levels right. I'm hoping we got this right in general. I think I made to turn the vibration off on the controller a little bit, but we'll probably be all right.
Yeah.
I got some interesting news for you on the ever evolving front of our public information podcast. So last week tonight with John Oliver had a new episode last night, and guess what the main topic was?
Oh, that's always exciting. Let me guess. If John Oliver's in the mix, it's probably something right up our alley. Maybe it's the Federal Reserve or something related. Do tell me, what did he dive into this time?
It wasn't that on the nose, but it was about immigration and ICE. So the episode that you and I did live on Friday, he did a much better version on Sunday night. So that's cool. At least we know that we're like talking about what people who know better think is the most important stuff to be talking about. I feel like at least we're like in the right part of the conversation, you know?
Absolutely. That's a pretty good sign we're on the pulse of the conversation. I mean, if John Oliver is hitting the same topics just a couple of days later, it definitely means we're in the right lane. So, yeah, it's kind of a nice little confidence boost. We might not have the HBO budget, but we're definitely on the right track.
I'll tell you. So I believe the ship itself is docked over the main objective, but the truth is, I just don't feel that I can go down there yet. I don't. I don't think it's right that I get down there and play this awesome game right away. Not until we make sure everyone knows about the Federal Reserve Bank.
I like that dedication, but we got to keep our priorities straight, right? So let's get everyone up to speed on the Federal Reserve, and then the game can wait just a little bit. It's all about that good old podcast duty first. Once we get everyone in the loop, then we can dive into it.
So let me see really quickly. I got the wrong emote. That's not. Can you hear that?
Yep, I can hear you loud and clear, and no worries at all if you grab the wrong emote or something. These things happen. We're all good on this side. Just let me know whenever you're set, and we'll roll right back into it.
All right. So I guess our first question has to be for this topic is, what exactly is the Federal Reserve Bank?
Absolutely. Let's kick it off. So, the Federal Reserve Bank is basically the central bank of the United States. It was created back in 1913, and its main job is to oversee and stabilize the country's monetary policy. In other words, it's there to help keep the financial system steady, manage inflation, and try to hit employment targets. So, it's kind of the backbone of how money and banking stay balanced in the US.
And
And
oh, go ahead.
absolutely, just rolling right along. So, yeah, that's a nice, straightforward starting point for what the Fed is. Whenever you're ready with the next question, we'll just keep the ball rolling.
Well, based on that definition, is the Federal Reserve Bank like there's a line from a movie that said there's nothing federal about the Federal Reserve Bank. It's about it's Federal Express. Where does the terminology come from, and why isn't the Federal Reserve itself a part of the government in the same way, say, NASA is a part of the government?
Yeah, that's a classic line and definitely a common misconception. So, the federal and Federal Reserve is a bit of a misnomer. It's not federal in the sense of being a standard government agency like NASA. Instead, the Federal Reserve is kind of a hybrid entity. It has both public and private aspects. In terms of where the terminology comes from, It was named the Federal Reserve because it was established by an act of Congress and it does serve the public interest, but it's designed to operate independently of direct political control. It's got a board of governors that's appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And then it has these 12 regional reserve banks that have a more private structure. So it's independent in making its decisions, but is still ultimately accountable to Congress. In short, it's a bit of a unique beast, neither fully government nor fully private, which is why it can sometimes be a little confusing.
And when you say it's beholden to Congress, what are the actual things Congress can do to affect the bank in terms of holding it accountable or affecting how they do business?
So when we say the Federal Reserve is accountable to Congress, it basically means a few things. Congress has oversight powers. For example, the Fed chair has to testify in front of Congress regularly. They do these semi-annual reports where they basically explain what they're doing with monetary policy and answer a bunch of questions from lawmakers. Congress also sets the Federal Reserve's goals by law. So they've given the Fed a mandate, which is to aim for stable prices, maximum employment, and moderate long term interest rates. And while the Fed has independence in how it achieves that, those goals are set by Congress. In extreme cases, Congress could patent laws to reform how the Fed works if they really wanted to. But in general, the idea is that the Fed operates independently day to day, but it still has to answer to Congress and ultimately to the American people through that oversight process.
How does the Board of Governors work? Who selects those folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Board of Governors is basically the leadership team at the top of the Fed. It's made up of 7 members, and these folks are nominated by the President of the United States and then confirmed by the Senate. Each governor serves a pretty long term, 14 years actually, and that's done on purpose to kind of insulate them from political pressures. The idea is that they can make long term decisions without worrying about the next election cycle. The president also designates one of those governors as the chair, and the chair is kind of like the public face of the Fed.
And the
Like the
current.
spokes.
Go ahead, sorry.
No problem at all. Just to finish that thought, the chair of the Fed is really the one you see in the news the most, but the whole board of governors works together to set policy, and yeah, that's basically how they get chosen and what they do. So whenever you're ready to roll on to the next piece, just let me know.
I will. I wanted just to quickly bring it around to current events. So the current chair is Jerome Powell, correct? And if that's true, how many governor seats are there available for the current administration to choose new board members?
Yeah, you're spot on. As of now, Jerome Powell is indeed the current chair of the Fed. In terms of how many governor seats are available right now, it can vary depending on retirements, resignations, or if someone's term just ends. Usually there are 7 seats total on the board. Sometimes a few might be vacant, which gives the current administration a chance to nominate new members. Right now, I believe there's at least 1 seat that's open for a new appointment, but of course that can change if more terms expire or if there's any movement on the board. So, yeah, the administration usually gets a chance to shape the Fed a little bit depending on those vacancies.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay, well, before we're gonna circle back to Jerome Powell when we get more to what's happening currently with the Fed. But let's break this up with our first ad from our Super Earth sponsor, Liberty Lift. Go ahead. 20 seconds, please.
You got it. This episode is brought to you by Liberty Lift Mech Enhancements. Need a little extra boost on those long hay diving missions? Liberty Lift is here to make sure your gear can handle any terrain. Power up and stand tall with Liberty Lift because even heroes need a little lift sometimes.
Okay, so we're back. The Liberty Lift ad was super awesome. I like the idea of mech enhancements for the game. Hint, hint, wink, wink at Arrowhead. Okay, but let's get back to the actual serious topic. What does the Federal Reserve do on a day-to-day basis? What is their core function?
Yeah, let's dive right back into it. So, on a day to day basis, The Federal Reserve actually does quite a few things, but their core functions really boil down to a few key tasks. First and foremost, they set interest rates, and that's a huge part of their job. By raising or lowering the federal funds rate, they can influence how expensive or cheap it is to borrow money. That trickles down to everything from mortgages to car loans to business loans. They also regulate and supervise banks to make sure that the banking system stays stable and consumers are protected. And they manage the money supply, which means they do things like buy and sell government securities to keep the economy on an even keel. And finally, they act as a lender of last resort. So if there's a financial crisis, they step in and make sure banks have the liquidity they need so the whole system doesn't freeze up. So those are the big day-to-day functions in a nutshell.
In a nutshell. So when we hear the economics reports on the news network talk about interest rates, whether they're going to raise them or lower them, how does that factor into the Federal Reserve's day-to-day functions? How can we help people understand how the bread gets baked?
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. Explaining how the bread gets baked. So when you hear those news reports about the Fed possibly raising or lowering interest rates, what they're really talking about is the Fed adjusting that federal funds rate. And that's basically the interest rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans. Now, the reason that matters is because when the Fed changes that rate, it kind of sets off a chain reaction. It influences all sorts of interest rates throughout the economy. So if the Fed lowers rates, borrowing money gets cheaper. That means people might take out more loans to buy homes, cars, or businesses might invest more because credit is cheaper. On the flip side, if the Fed raises rates, borrowing gets more expensive, and that might slow down spending a bit to keep inflation in check. So basically, the Fed is like the baker adjusting the oven temperature to make sure the economy doesn't overheat or get too cold. And that's how those news reports tie into what the Fed is doing every day.
Understood. I think I understand. Let's see here. I am not an economist, and I'm hoping that we can sort of boil this down in a way that someone who finds this report will have a better understanding of how the uh, the Federal Reserve works. So, to sort of recap how far we've come since the beginning of the show to now, are we talking about, say, a consortium of banks as the Federal Reserve instead of an actual physical located bank?
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. The Federal Reserve isn't just one single bank building somewhere. It's more like a system. You've got the Board of Governors in DC, and then you have these 12 regional reserve banks spread out across the country, and they all work together kind of like a consortium, exactly. Each of those regional banks serves its own district, and together they form the whole Federal Reserve System. So, yeah, it's not like a traditional bank where you'd walk in and open a checking account. Instead, it's this network that oversees and supports the nation's economy behind the scenes. So I think you've definitely got the gist of it.
Let's try and tie it a little bit more to a broader picture. So we know from other areas that like states like California pay a lot more towards the federal government's resources in terms of taxation. It's considered a donor state, as the term goes. So you said that the Federal Reserve kicks in during economic crisis, and it's broken up into regions. How does that work in terms of if, let's say, right now we have a lot of natural disasters affecting one region of the country? How does the Federal Reserve kick in to help in that regard, and how do the different regions come into play?
Yeah, that's a really good broader question. So, when it comes to how the Federal Reserve steps in during crises, especially if a particular region is hit hard, like by natural disasters, the regional reserve banks can play a role. They help make sure that local banks in those areas have access to the funds they need to keep operating. So, if there's a big disruption, like a hurricane or wildfires or something that causes a lot of economic strain in one region, the regional reserve bank in that area is kind of like the first responder in terms of the financial system. They can provide emergency lending to banks that need it. They can help maintain the flow of cash and basically make sure that the local economy can keep functioning even under stress. So, in that sense, those regional differences and having the system spread out does help them respond more locally. And while it's not exactly like redistributing taxes, it is a way that the Fed can support different regions within Trump.
Okay. I think I have a better understanding a little bit. So, how does the Federal Reserve affect the U.S. economy as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the big picture, the Federal Reserve really influences the entire U.S. economy through those interest rates we talked about, through controlling inflation, and by making sure that employment stays stable. When the Fed changes interest rates, it affects how much people and businesses want to spend or save. When they keep inflation under control, it means your money holds its value, and that creates a more stable environment for everybody. So, in a nutshell, the Fed is kind of like the guardian of the U.S. economy, making sure things don't swing too far in one direction or another. And by doing that, they help the whole economy stay on track, which affects everything from jobs to prices to how easy it is to get a loan.
Okay, so one thing I keep hearing is that it was created at a time to address a problem, an economic issue, and now it works as a way of maintaining the economic strength at certain levels. So it ideally benefits most of us, however, or whatever. But that to me begs a question of, is the Federal Reserve the best solution to that particular problem?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question, and it's something economists and policymakers have debated for a long time. So, the Federal Reserve was indeed created back in 1913 because the U.S. had gone through a bunch of financial panics and crises, and they needed some kind of central authority to stabilize things. And over the years, the Fed has evolved into this institution that's supposed to keep the economy on a stable footing. Now, is it the best solution? Well, that depends on who you ask. Some people think the Fed does a great job at smoothing out the ups and downs of the economy. Other people argue that maybe it has too much power or that there could be other ways to manage the economy. But overall, the Fed is the system we have, and it's been refined over more than a century. And for the most part, it's done a decent job of keeping things stable, even if it's not perfect. So it's a fair debate, but that's kind of where it stands.
Fair enough. Um, okay, based on no, I'm sorry. Most of what we're talking about, whether we know it or not, is based on some sort of economic theory or policy made by an economist someplace. You know what I mean? Like, we're talking about free market economy, we're talking about capitalism, whatever we're talking about, whether we know it or not. Some academic person with an economics degree figured it out long before we got here. So, in that regard, are there any published alternatives to running or maintaining the American economy that are alternatives to the Federal Reserve Bank?
Yeah, definitely. There have been a lot of different economic theories and proposals out there over the years. Like you said, a lot of smart economists have thought about these things. So some people have suggested different models. For example, there are folks who advocate for something called free banking, where you wouldn't have a central bank at all, and individual banks would just issue their own currencies and kind of regulate themselves. There are other people who think that maybe we should have more direct government control rather than an independent central bank. And then there are folks who have proposed things like using a rules-based system where in the Fed or some other body would just follow a really strict rule for how to manage the money supply rather than making judgment calls. So yeah, there are definitely alternatives out there that people have talked about. None of them have been put into place on a large scale, but it's always an ongoing conversation in economics. So it's definitely a cool topic to dig into.
So I want to dig into it a little bit more, but let's first kind of add another layer first. So before we look more at alternatives, can we get a little deeper into how the Federal Reserve impacts everyday Americans? Like, when you get up and start your day, what are the different ways that the decisions made by the Federal Reserve Bank affecting you as an everyday American citizen?
Absolutely, and that's a great layer to add in. So, on an everyday level, the Fed's decisions can feel kind of invisible, but they actually do touch a lot of parts of your life. For example, if you have a mortgage or you're thinking about buying a house, the interest rate on that mortgage is going to be influenced by what the Fed does. If they lower rates, you might get a cheaper mortgage. If they raise rates, it might cost a little bit more. The same thing goes for credit cards, car loans, student loans, any kind of parking. It also affects the job market. So when the Fed is trying to keep employment stable, their policies can influence how many jobs are available and how quickly wages might grow. And of course, inflation is a big one. If the Fed keeps inflation under control, that means the prices of everyday goods aren't rising too fast and your paycheck stretches a little further. So, in short, the Fed's decisions kind of ripple out into all those areas of everyday life, even if you don't always notice it day to day.
All right, all right. Okay, so when we factor in how those decisions affect everyday Americans, are there any alternatives that most of the Americans maybe aren't aware of that they might consider as a better alternative than the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, definitely. So, there are a few alternatives that sometimes come up in public discussions, even if they're not super widely known. One idea that occasionally pops up is the notion of something like a public banking system, where instead of having a central bank like the Fed, you'd have banks that are owned by the public and run sort of like public utilities. The idea is that these public banks would be more directly accountable to local communities and could maybe offer lower cost services. Another idea that's floated is the concept of using technology, about cryptocurrencies or decentralized finance, to create a more distributed monetary system that doesn't rely on a central authority. Now, none of these alternatives are mainstream and they all have their own pros and cons, but for people who are interested in different ways of running the economy, those are some of the ideas that are out there. And it's always good to know that there are other ways to think about it, even if the Fed is the system we have right now.
Okay, you brought up crypto, and I figured we were going to have to do an entire episode about cryptocurrency at some point. I know that one of the arguing points for crypto's benefits is it's decentralized. But again, I'm no economist, and I want to kind of tiptoe into that to get a better understanding about many other things before we try to get an understanding about that. But before we do our next break, is that a viable alternative to the Federal Reserve banking system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is definitely a big topic. So, cryptocurrency is often brought up as a decentralized alternative. And some people do see it as a potential way to have a more distributed or decentralized financial system. But whether it's a fully viable alternative at this point, it's still up for debate. Cryptocurrencies have some advantages like being decentralized and sometimes offer more privacy, but they also come with a lot of volatility and they're not as stable or as integrated into the economy as traditional currencies. So at this point, it's more of an interesting idea and a growing area of technology rather than a complete replacement for something like the Federal Reserve. But it's definitely something that people are keeping an eye on and it could evolve in the future. So it's kind of a wait and see situation. Absolutely. Let's jump right into that ad spot. Here we go. This episode is brought to you by Citizen Chow, Sucrehurst's only meal delivery service designed just for our Helldivers. Tired of standard rations? Citizen Chow brings you gourmet, ready to eat meals that are perfect after a long day of defending freedom. Just order from your bunker and we'll drop a delicious meal pod right at your doorstep. Citizen Chow, fuel up like a hero. The saving the galaxy should taste amazing. And there we go. As all set. All right, ad break done. And
Let's go into what are some of the things people often get wrong about the Federal Reserve?
so one of the big misconceptions people often have is they think the Federal Reserve is just like any other government agency. In reality, it's this unique hybrid that's independent but still accountable to Congress. Another common misconception is that the Fed just prints money whenever it wants. In reality, it's more about managing the money supply through things like interest rates and open market operations rather than literally printing cash. And then there's the idea that the Fed can fix everything instantly, which isn't quite true. It's more of a balancing act over time. So those are some of the things people often get wrong. And yeah, it's great that we can clear that up.
Okay, so we already talked about Jerome Powell and the one seat of the Board of Governors that is available right now. And I believe that the President of the United States, the current president, who is Donald Trump, is, I believe he has a pick already. And that pick is very much saying whatever he says. And right now, Donald Trump and Jerome Powell do not see eye to eye on how best to steer the ship. Can you give us some details on their disagreement?
Absolutely. So right now, there's a bit of a disagreement between President Trump and Jerome Powell over interest rate policy. Essentially, Trump wants the Fed to cut rates more aggressively to stimulate the economy, while Powell is more focused on keeping inflation under control. And it's caused a bit of a tug of war. Trump has even suggested that the Fed board should override Powell if he doesn't get on board with rate cuts. So that's the gist of their disagreement right now.
Is this fight and the threats the president is making, is there any precedence for this sort of behavior between the two organizations or the two bodies?
Yeah, absolutely. There is some historical precedent for this kind of tension. Presidents have, from time to time, tried to pressure the Fed to move interest rates in their preferred direction. For instance, President Nixon did it in the early 70s with his Fed chair, and there were even earlier instances like President Johnson having a bit of a showdown with his Fed chair in the 60s. So it's not unheard of, but it is always a bit of a balancing act between the Fed's independence and the president's preferences. So what we're seeing now is kind of a modern version of an old story.
Fair enough. Historically, has the president ever been proven right from their position?
So historically speaking, there have been times when presidents push the Fed in a certain direction. Sometimes it seemed to work out in the short term, like during World War II when the Fed kept rates low to help finance the war effort. But in the long run, those kinds of pressures have sometimes led to issues like inflation. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes the president's push might align with what the economy needs in the short term, but it can have complex effects over time. So it's not always a clear win or lose scenario.
And in our current situation, where do most economists fall? Do they agree with what Jerome Powell is saying or with what the president is saying? President being Donald Trump.
So right now, most economists tend to lean towards supporting the Federal Reserve's independence and the cautious approach that Jerome Powell is taking. The general consensus among a lot of economists is that it's important for the Fed to remain independent of political pressure so they can make decisions based on economic data rather than political considerations. So in this current situation, economists largely side with Powell's more measured approach rather than the more aggressive rate cutting stance that Trump is pushing for.
There was a little bit of a hiccup there in what you were saying, so I want to make sure we're being fair, because while I don't support the fallacy of fair and balanced, I do think that there are times that we need to hear what the actual arguments are. So, for those economists who support the president's position, what is their argument?
So, to give a fair view, the economists who support the president's position generally argue that more aggressive rate cuts could stimulate economic growth more quickly. They believe that lowering interest rates would make borrowing cheaper, which could boost spending and investment. Essentially, they're focused on the short-term benefits of stimulating the economy more rapidly and are less concerned about the potential long-term inflationary risks. So that's basically their argument in a nutshell.
My issue with that position, I suppose, is always that it's never a full measure. If you wanted to argue that you are going to make borrowing easier, it's only because you want to have banks ready to pounce on my new short-term good fortune. it'd be far more compelling if you were also championing raising my wages on top of what you were proposing, so it didn't feel like you were just trying to set up a pit for me to fall in. Because I feel like that is what makes that position so unpopular. It's not really designed to help people. It's more greasing the wheels to make going in our pockets a little bit easier. Am I a little bit too paranoid there?
No, I think it's totally reasonable to have that concern. A lot of people feel that way because if you're only focusing on making borrowing easier, but you're not talking about wages or long-term stability, it can feel like a short-term fix that doesn't really address the bigger picture. It's not paranoid to want a more balanced approach that looks out for everyday people as well as the broader economy. So it's a totally fair perspective.
Okay, so I think we're gonna try and wrap this up so we can get to some actual hell diving. So can we get our final ad for Super Earth, our final 20-second spot, brought to you by it looks like it's Brew Battalion Coffee is who's our final sponsor. Ready whenever you are.
Absolutely. Let's roll into that final ad spot. Here we go. This episode is brought to you by Brew Battalion Coffee, the official fuel of Super Earth's finest. When you need a boost before your next hell dive, reach for a cup of Brew Battalion. Bold, strong, and guaranteed to keep you alert on any mission. Brew Battalion, because every hero deserves great coffee. And there we go. Final ad wrapped up, and we're good to go.
I think that went all right. I think that was smooth. I am excited to edit this episode after I actually get down there and kick some bot butt for the major order. Okay, but first things first, let's see if we can get this home. Okay, for the actionable intel section, we want to know like how this can help our fellow Americans, because we're right next to the bank, but all over the world there's hell divers who might benefit from knowing a little bit more about how this system works. If someone wants to keep an eye on what the Fed is doing, what should they watch?
Absolutely. Let's bring it home with that action of the intel. So if someone wants to keep tabs on what the Fed is up to, there are a few key things to watch. First, they can keep an eye on the Fed's interest rate announcements. Those usually come out after the Federal Relevant Market Committee meetings, which happen several times a year. Second, they can pay attention to the Fed's public statements and press conferences where the chair, Jerome Powell, will explain what they're doing and why. And finally, they can look at economic indicators like inflation reports and employment data, because those are the things the Fed uses to make its decisions. So those are the big things to watch.
All right. Okay, so let's try and recap this. Our goal was to provide information that people who didn't know about the Federal Reserve Bank, if they watched this episode, they would know more. So let's recap. What did we learn today about the Federal Reserve Bank?
Absolutely. Let's recap it. So we covered a lot of ground today. We learned that the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States, created in 1913 to help stabilize the financial system. We talked about how the Fed sets interest rates, regulates banks, and works to control inflation and employment. We also discussed some of the current debates and controversies, like the difference of opinion between President Trump and Jerome Powell on interest rates, and how most economists generally support the Fed's independence. And finally, we talked about what people can watch if they want to keep track of what the Fed is doing, like interest rate announcements and economic data. So hopefully anyone watching this episode now has a much clearer picture of what the Federal Reserve is and how it affects them.
All right. Well, that went great. So the major order for the day is still to take out as many enemies as we can using the orbital rail strike. So I am going to get down there and assist my fellow Helldivers in doing just that. And I feel like I can enjoy it more now that we did our thing. So We got our social media. Not social media. We got our multiplayer flag on. It is time, my friend, for us to get down there and give these automaton scumbags the business.